Welcome to Cablesfarm. Why don't you pull up a chair, sit down and watch what we've got to offer. Right, this is how we sharpen square gravers by hand. Here's a model of a graver because you can't see very easily on the camera from if I show you the real thing being a 1/8 inch square by 3 inch high-speed steel blank. So this is a model of that. You can see here that we're going to cut and use this for cutting steel. We're going to grind the main face off at 45 degrees on the diagonal, so that's, if you look at that, that's how we're going to grind that face off. And then in addition to that face, we have two very important small faces on the bottom of the tool, which are called the heels. And the heels are ground off so that the engraver, when it's parallel in this direction to the stone, is canted up at 15 degrees. So we're going to grind those two off, or sharpen those two off at that angle. Now, the little keel that you form on the bottom here is crucial, because this is the bit that the engraver rides on when you're engraving. So this is how you control the depth of the cut. So if you dip the handle down, then that keel takes the cutter out. If you lift the handle up, then the keel will push the cutter further into the metal. So that's your depth control there. And you'll see that this distance, when you come to a real cutter, is about 1/4 millimeter. So it's a very small keel, 1/2 millimeter at the most, and the amount of metal that you take off on these two faces is minimal. So the first job you have is to grind down the 45 degrees. Now this will be rough ground on a wheel probably. Now there's several ways of doing this. Mainly I use a hone, but when I'm doing it by hand, I'll use a jig which I've made that holds the cutter at 45 degrees onto the stone and allows you to wheel it backwards and forwards. I'll show you how to use that in a minute. An alternative is the crocker, which you can buy, is the crocker jig, where you run the jig backwards and forwards on a surface and the tool is on the stone, and sharpen it that way. And this has got 3 lots of adjustment. It's a fiddle. I don't use this. It's a fiddle to set up, but it is something you can buy. It's called a crocker jig. Now the stones, or I call them stones, are a diamond about probably 400 grit or so. This is a cheap one. You need to get a diamond with a continuous surface. The diamonds that have got plastic bits in them are no good, because the area you're sharpening is very small. So that's a cheap 400 grit stone or diamond. This is an expensive extra fine DMT diamond, which is extremely fine. In fact, if you run your finger over it, you wouldn't even think it was any kind of a sharpening stone, but it does work. So the technique for doing the sharpening then is to take my graver that needs sharpening, and I'll stick that in my little wheelie jig there. Now you need some kind of means of measuring the angles, so you can use a protractor for measuring the angle, lining it up against that, or you can use, I cut a credit card into the right angle so I can do it simply. So that's the 45 degree angle. I've actually cut a little crib on the end of a credit card that lets me know how far I've got to stick it out in order to get the right angle. So I'm going to show you that. So the first job will be to grind this down until you've got a uniform surface at 45 degrees. So we keep going on that. You can use these diamonds dry, or you can put water or oil on them. So having got that done, we can then polish that off on the extra fine, and we'll get a nice shiny face on there. I don't know whether you can see that on the camera, but there's a very fine face on there. Then we take that out of that jig. We can then take any burrs that we've thrown up on the edge of the tool there, and then so we should then have that perfectly shaped. Now we need to change the jig to a little jig that I've got here that's much smaller, that does the 15-degree faces. And this is a bit fiddly to get them lined up to 15 degrees. I've got a card here that I've made a 15-degree angle on, which I can use to align that, and I've got a jig which on a piece of card which I've set up to give me the right protrusion there. So if I do that, then I've got to take these two faces off. Now, as I showed you before, they're really very small faces. There's really very little metal to be removed off there, so you only touch them on the extra fine diamond, and you'll need only to move the tool on there a relatively few times in order to take that off, and you need to make sure that those two faces are of comparable size, so you need to count the number of strokes you make on each side. So I think we'll do 3 strokes, 1, 2, 3, and then we'll change over to the other side, jig it up there, and 1, 2, 3, and that should get us beautifully even faces on the heel. Now, the final stroke is to take the main face burrs, which will have been thrown up by cutting the heels, and we put that on a 2000 grit piece of paper and just drag it very lightly across there. We could do it on a piece of leather actually, and that will get the tool perfect for cutting. Then we just have to check it. Now, the way that engravers always check their graver sharpness is to push the point of them up their fingernail, and if it will dig in under its own weight, then it's sharp. You don't need to push down on it to get it to dig in, it should just dig in under its own weight. So that will be a nice sharp tool now. For more information on engraver sharpeners, visit cablesfarm.co.uk. Thank you.